Hello and welcome to Critical Weight Theory. So picture it. October 11th, 1975, 11:30 p.m. Most Americans tuning in probably had no idea they were about to watch television history. What aired that night on NBC wasn't yet the cultural institution we now know as Saturday Night Live or SNL. It didn't have decades of political satire behind it. It didn't have famous catchphrases or characters or viral sketches or any of that stuff. It was still an experiment. The show was called NBC's Saturday Night, and this was before any Americans were aware of that expression. Live from New York, it's Saturday night. And interestingly enough, the show actually had a naming problem. The reason for the awkward title of the first episode was simple. The name Saturday Night Live was already taken. Sportscaster Howard Cosell had a competing ABC show called Saturday Night Live with Howard Cosell, which premiered a month earlier in September 1975, and Cosell's cast was known as the Primetime Players. So NBC actually leaned into that joke for this premiere. When their show debuted, the cast was introduced as the Not Ready for Primetime Players, and that title has kind of stuck ever since. It was self deprecating, but also, in a way, sort of accurate. Nobody really knew if this thing would work. And the first host, none other than George Carlin. NBC opened the series with a bold choice for a host. Yes, the sometimes offensive comedian, George Carlin. By 1975, Carlin was already famous and controversial. His stand up routines pushed boundaries in ways that network television usually would avoid. One routine in particular had already made him notorious: his 7 words you can never say on television routine. The bit was sharp, funny, and confrontational. It eventually led to a landmark Supreme Court case, FCC versus Pacifica Foundation, which was decided in 1978, that reshaped how broadcast regulators handled indecent language, as it was called. So, choosing Carlin as the first host sent a message. This show wasn't going to play it safe. And interestingly, Carlin did not appear in the sketches on the show. Instead, he performed several stand up segments throughout the night, acting almost like a comedic narrator between pieces. That format would not become the norm, of course, but on the first night, it created a bridge between stand up comedy and live television experimentation. And in his lifetime, of course, Carlin regularly said things that you were not supposed to, like simply acknowledging that this country was founded by slave owners who wanted to be free. And there was a feeling probably that he'd say anything on stage. So it was definitely a bit of a bold idea. For 1975 network television, his being the host really was a statement. And what about the cast, though, the rest of them? Well, the premiere introduced the original ensemble. There was Chevy Chase, John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd, Gilda Radner, Jane Curtin, Garrett Morris, and Lorraine Newman. They were young, mostly unknown, and wildly different from the polished performers typically seen on network television. The show itself was created and produced by Lorne Michaels, who believed late night television could be looser, stranger, and more experimental than anything airing in prime time. And the timing mattered too. As Michaels later said, 1975 was a hinge moment in America. The country was still reeling from Watergate. President Richard Nixon resigned just a year earlier, and the Vietnam War had ended months before. Trust in institutions was low, and satire suddenly had sharper teeth. And the musical guests are probably at least in my opinion, one of the strengths of the episode. The first episode established something that would become a signature of the show, the live musical performances, and two artists appeared that night, which would not always be the case. Usually it was just one artist, but in the early days of SNL, you might have two, you might have a bigger variety of things. You had Billy Preston, who delivered high energy performances of Nothing from Something and Fancy Lady, two great songs. I quite enjoyed those performances. And then Janice Ian, whose haunting folk songs at 17 and In the Winter brought a completely different emotional tone to the stage. The contrast between Preston's funk driven energy and Ian's introspective melancholy set the template for SNL's musical variety. So you had a blend of this music, sketches, an experimental vibe, and the sense that things could be chaotic. The episode itself was loose, and some sketches worked, some didn't, in my opinion. And the ideas were there for what would become the standard format of the show, but this doesn't feel quite like the 1980s 1990s SNL. It definitely doesn't feel as polished, and in some ways it kind of suffers from that. But it's a very innovative episode anyway. The cold open featured a satirical political ad for a fictional Wolverines political party, poking fun at the upcoming 1976 presidential race. There was also a strange and memorable appearance by Andy Kaufman, who was sort of the innovative, I guess you could say, godfather of cringe comedy. He performed a bizarre routine with a record player, lip syncing the Mighty Mouse theme song, and it's proof that you could really make anything into comedy, because if you were to seriously analyze the sketch, like, you could easily shrug it off and say, what's the big deal here? Why are people even finding this funny? But it's the innovation, it's the unique and unexpected approach to comedy that was part of why his appearance there was successful, especially at the time. you know, Comedy didn't typically look like Andy Kaufman, so that was one of the, memorable components of that episode. Kaufman's act was awkward, unpredictable, and completely unlike anything else on television, and it is another thing that really gave the episode some edge. It was perfect for Saturday Night Live's premiere. And you even had the Muppets, but darker than we typically see the Muppets. It's a surprising segment that came from Jim Henson. These Muppets were not the friendly characters that many people remember from The Muppet Show. The sketch was darker, stranger, and more adult in tone. And allegedly, some people actually hated Jim Henson's presence in the episode. It's said that one of the writers even complained, "I don't write for felt." You know, they were trying to dismiss the presence of the Muppets on the show. Apparently, at least some people were. But nevertheless, Lorne Michaels saw something in his craft and wanted that to be part of the experience. It wasn't a perfect fit for the show, even though these Muppet moments did sometimes get a few laughs. They would bring back Jim Henson and the Muppets in some future episodes, but of course, he wouldn't stay there as a forever part of the show or anything like that. It just demonstrated how experimental the early episodes were, and it was more of a variety show. And you also had the birth of Weekend Update. The premiere included an early version of what would become one of the show's defining segments. Chevy Chase appeared behind a news desk to deliver a parody news broadcast, And it wasn't fully formed yet, but the bones of Weekend Update were there. There was a deadpan delivery, some absurd headlines, political jokes delivered as if they were real news, and the format would go on to become one of the longest running comedy segments in TV history. Then there was the famous bee sketch. It's one of the strangest sketches of the night, and it involved a bee hospital. Cast members were dressed as bees, while newbie fathers were informed about the ranks their newborns would hold in the hive. It was surreal, slightly chaotic, and exactly the sort of oddball humor that early SNL sought to normalize. And to some degree, it was successful. It's one of the things that people most remember from the early Saturday Night Live seasons. Those wacky bees. John Belushi would later become famous for his recurring samurai character, but in the early episodes, the show was still experimenting with everything, even bees. It was a real cultural moment, and when you watch the first episode today, it feels raw. The pacing is uneven, some jokes fall flat, and you can sense that the audience isn't always understanding what exactly is happening. The audience doesn't always know when to laugh either. That's one of the problems with live comedy. But the DNA of modern SNL is already there. You have the live sketches, stand up segments, topical satire, musical performances, and a willingness to try ideas that might fail. And the premiere didn't instantly become a smash hit, but it launched something enormous. Saturday Night Live would obviously go on to become one of the longest running shows in American television history, and it helped launch the careers of comedians who would shape film, television, and comedy for decades. And perhaps most importantly, it proved that live television could be unpredictable and mostly make it work. And at the end of the broadcast, the cast gathered together for the traditional good nights. You can see that they looked exhausted and a little relieved, and maybe a little stunned by what they just pulled off. Because whether they realized it or not, they just made some TV history. So next time you hear someone say live from New York at Saturday Night Live, remember that the first time it aired, nobody knew if the show would even survive not just one season, but after one episode.